The man standing with Dr. King in this photograph on the left is Bernard Lafayette. And a picture of Dr. Lafayette several years later is shown in color there on the right. I really started to learn about nonviolence back in 1997 when I went through a training in Rhode Island with Dr. Lafayette. And I'd like to talk today about getting started learning about nonviolence. I'll tell a little bit about that early training, and mostly I want to just identify some books that are good to read about nonviolence if you really want to go to the source. And so we, in 1997, we went through a training that was originally designed for the Providence Police Department. And one of my colleagues, Abu Bakr, and I were both living in Providence at the time. We worked at the University of Rhode Island. And we were thinking of starting a center to study conflict resolution and help department chairs like myself to be better problem solvers, really. I think that was the principal aim originally. But we went through this training with Dr. Lafayette, and we began to learn about nonviolence through a study of the civil rights movement. Dr. Lafayette had worked with Dr. King, had been a member of his staff, and before that had been a freedom rider and one of the kids who organized the sit-in movement. And he knew a lot about nonviolence in a very hands-on, practical way. But he also introduced us to nonviolence through books that Martin Luther King had written. And at the time, I was only dimly aware that Martin Luther King had written any books. You know, he only lived to the age of 39. But we are very fortunate to have several books that convey to us his thinking and his approach to nonviolence and his take on many problems of his day. So in the training that we went through, the first book that Bernard introduced us to is called The Trumpet of Conscience. The Trumpet of Conscience. And it's a very short book. It's less than 80 pages long. But it's a great introduction to Dr. King and the way he expresses himself. These were given in 1967 as lectures over the Canadian Broadcasting System radio. They were the Massey Lectures of that year. The Massey Lectures being a series, very distinguished series of lectures that are now broadcast. I guess they were, I assume they're still being broadcast. But that's a very good book to start with because it's short, but it's representative. And it has Dr. King talking about nonviolence in his own chosen way. 1967 was fairly late in his life, unfortunately, but he had several years of experience thinking about nonviolence and using it in his work. Now, the next book that we became aware of in Dr. Lafayette's training was Dr. King's very first book, the one that he wrote just after the Montgomery bus boycott. So here's my first edition of that book. The book is called Stride Toward Freedom, subtitled The Montgomery Story. And it's Martin Luther King's own account of that first major movement that he led. Montgomery bus boycott took place over the course of a little over a year, and it resulted in a Supreme Court decision that struck down segregated bus systems like the one in Montgomery. We learned about that history, and we also intensively read one of the chapters in this book, which is called Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. In that chapter, Dr. King first gives sort of a memoir about his own education, the teachers that he had, the authors that he read, and he sifts their ideas. He accepts the positions of some people, he rejects ideas from other people, and he weighs different approaches in a way that I wish every public intellectual and every important thinker would do. It gives his reflections on his own growth as a thinker. And then the second part, the last few pages of the chapter, Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, present Dr. King's 6 principles of nonviolence. I'll have some more to say about those in later videos, but you can go to the website of the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Change. The center is in Atlanta. The website, among many other things, talks about nonviolence and the 6 principles of nonviolence from this book. And I recommend that the King Center as a resource for people who are trying to learn about nonviolence in the American tradition. America has this great tradition of nonviolence revolving around the civil rights movement. And I think for people in the United States, it makes the most sense to study nonviolence through the history of the civil rights movement and the larger freedom struggle of which it is a part. If you're looking to buy a new copy of Stride Toward Freedom, it will probably look like this. This is the appearance of the new editions of Dr. King's works that are being produced by the center at Stanford that is responsible for his written legacy. So Stride Toward Freedom, highly recommended. A few years later, in 1963, Dr. King produced this book. This is a collection of essays and sermons called Strength to Love. These are wonderfully written in King's characteristic style. Some people find his language a little too flowery, but I think it's very poetic. And these are essays that have changed lives, that have turned lives around, with titles like, let's see, A Tough Mind and a Tender Heart, On Being a Good Neighbor, Loving Your Enemies, A Knock at Midnight, which is a famous reminiscence, Shattered Dreams, and so on, Antidotes for Fear. Those essays are central to Dr. King's thinking. And again, all of his books are strongly recommended. Why We Can't Wait is another collection of essays. And it includes the famous Letter from Birmingham Jail. This book was produced after the Birmingham campaign that led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And as you may know, the Civil Rights Act struck down discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, and sex. The inclusion of sex meant that the Civil Rights Act opened the gates of employment and higher education for women, as well as for racial minorities. It's one of our most important laws. another book with, this one only has 6 chapters and an appendix, but it comes a little bit later. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And in this book, Dr. King addresses the challenge of Black power, which he contested with in his day. He has a famous chapter called The World House, in which he addresses the broader implications of a nonviolent approach for bringing people together globally. And it brings into focus these 2 important missions that shouldn't come into conflict, although they sometimes do. One is the advancement of African Americans, and the other is the advancement of nonviolence for everybody, and an approach to problem solving and conflict resolution that we can all benefit from. Now, Dr. Lafayette himself produced a book with my friend Katherine Johnson a few years ago, and it's called In Peace and Freedom, My Journey in Selma. In this book, Katherine interviews Bernard. You'll notice that the image on the cover is from that photograph that I showed you at the beginning, him standing as a young man with Dr. King. And Selma was another great campaign during the Civil Rights Movement. It led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, another hugely important piece of legislation in the history of our country, but a law that is under attack these days and has been eroded by Supreme Court decisions and by other attempts to limit voting rights, and that is in the news, and you may know about it that way. This is a way to understand the Voting Rights Act in perhaps a little deeper way. I've written a book with my late colleague Ira Zepp. The cover looks like this. The title is Nonviolence, Origins and Outcomes. And this book is now in its 3rd edition. I'll just move it back so you can see it. Origins and outcomes is a phrase that indicates that we're dealing both with where nonviolence came from and also what its benefits are and what its outcomes and perhaps its future might be. It's part memoir, it's part student essays. I'm very interested as a teacher in how students respond to learning about nonviolence at the beginning. And so part of one chapter, large part of one chapter, is really written by students. There's an outline of what a nonviolence training consists of. And then there are essays about changes that I and my colleagues have observed in people who learn about nonviolence, because they become stronger in a number of ways, not just in laying down weapons and becoming more peaceful people, but also in becoming changed in a number of ways, in about 10 different ways. There's a chapter on nonviolence in the real world. It addresses the implications of nonviolence for police work and corrections work and military work. And it also examines the research that supports nonviolence. One of the things that struck me in that initial training with Dr. Lafayette was that this came across to me as a psychologist as being very good psychology. And I've tried to bring nonviolence and psychology more closely together over the last 25 years. Eventually, a person is going to want to look into where Martin Luther King got his ideas of nonviolence. And that is going to take you to the study of Mahatma Gandhi, um, great Indian um, leader, and really the energizing force behind India's eventual independence from Great Britain. Um, the the thing I would really recommend for getting to know Gandhi is his autobiography. This book covers a lot of his early career working in South Africa and the development of his ideas about nonviolence there. And then the last portion of the book, in part 5 of the autobiography, he tells the story of how he went back to India um, around the time of the First World War, and he began working with others toward the independence of India from Great Britain. That is a story that is long and complicated. Another good way of learning about it, perhaps, is to watch the movie Gandhi, the great Attenborough movie that was the Academy Award winner, I think, in 1982. And Gandhi is a controversial figure. You know, not everybody feels about him the way I do, or the way most other nonviolence advocates feel. But there's something to be learned here. There's a new way of thinking. There's a new toolkit that can be added to whatever skills you already have. And for that reason, I think it's worth getting into the study of what Gandhi did and why it was something new under the sun. You know, we often say that there hasn't been any progress in human affairs over the last thousands of years, that we've had tremendous progress in technology, but none in how people deal with each other, how people get things done with people who disagree with them. And I really think that Gandhi represents a break from the past in that regard, that he came up with something new in human affairs that we should all learn about when we're growing up through school, and that we should experiment with as he wanted us to in our everyday lives. A final recommendation that I'll show you here is a book called The Gandhi Reader. This is edited by Homer Jack, and it's a collection of a large number of writings, and it allows you to sample Gandhi's writing at many different points through his life. He was always writing. He would found a journal and then set himself up as the editor of the journal and also the principal writer for the journal. So he was always writing every day, and his collected works, if we looked at all of them, would probably cover a whole wall. From Martin Luther King, we got a beautiful handout of small books. From Gandhi, if we could look at everything, it would be an enormous library of work. He was a very good writer in English, and I think a very engaging writer with a kind of humility and a kind of wonder at how great people are and how great it is to be alive, that I think will be very engaging and fun for you to dip into. So that's it for today. I hope that you will subscribe to this channel and give it a like. I'm sure that if we get some comments on this video, they'll include additional suggestions about books to read on nonviolence. And I really welcome that, because there are many people out there who have a more detailed understanding of the literature than I do. I am primarily a teacher who works at the introductory level, trying to bring people into this field and get them interested. And I know there are scholars who are much more knowledgeable about the details. So I apologize if I've made any mistakes in characterizing this thing called nonviolence. And I hope you'll take a look at this. And as you begin to learn about nonviolence, that you enjoy it, but also derive things from it that can be really useful and fun for you. Learn new tools for your toolkit that may make you both more happy and more effective. So until next time, thanks a lot.